Well, sadly, this is the last rose of summer, a beautiful white rose from my son's garden. Even though it's a white rose, we're going to be putting color on the paper. Today you're going to be using a nice 2-inch flat brush for the background, a number 6 round, a number 2 round, a number 1 rigger, and a real fine scripter or liner. You're also going to be using a fan brush, but just for a few little areas, so you probably could do without it. We'll be using salt, just in a few places, not a lot of salting either. The coloring that you're going to be using, a few colors, nothing real bright, kind of a little bit on the cool side. Yellow, cad yellow or lemon yellow. We'll be using yellow ochre. We'll be using burnt sienna. You're also going to be using some ultramarine blue. That's going to get mixed with your green. Some sap green and some black. My drawing is very detailed because after the initial background coloring is put on, we are going to be painting petal by petal. So you need to know where those petals are. The first wash is on the entire painting, over the entire surface. And it is cadmium yellow mixed with a very little bit of sap green and a lot of water. You can see how light this wash is. Even though this is a wash of pale color being put on your rose will still look white, because the white roses just have that little bit of a tinge of a nice yellow green. So this is going on your entire background, nice and wet. And once it's completely put on, I'm going to add in a little bit of the yellow-green, slightly more intense, just on a few petals on my rose. So nice and wet, because when we put that little bit of extra color on, we want it to kind of soften itself in the background. This is just sap and cad yellow, a little bit more intense, and I'm putting it on right above the meat of the rose, that one open petal, and then the other petal more towards you in the foreground, the underside of that petal. Now you want to dry everything really well, and now we're going to start to be working on the background. I am filling in my background first, just to help me to figure out which petals are where. It's just a strategy to make it easier to see just the flower. This is sap mixed with a little bit of the ultramarine blue, and I am filling in my lower left background area first, filling it in totally with that sap mixed with a little bit of ultramarine blue and a lot of water. I want this to remain nice and wet because I am going to be putting black into that, and I want my black to move around and soften itself in the wetness of the green. I also am leaving that lower left corner white because that was an extra petal from another flower. It just adds a little bit of interest to the picture. I'm softening that edge with water because I don't want it to look like that petal is part of this rose. I want it to look like this petal is farther off in the distance slightly. So I softened it, the edge, with plain water. I'm filling this whole section in, this whole lower left section in with my sap mixed with a very little bit of ultramarine blue. Now I'm moving to the lower right background section, again doing the same thing, filling it in with my sap green and a little bit of ultramarine blue, and I am making it nice and wet because I'm going to be adding black over there also, and I'm going to be adding a little bit of burnt sienna. So if you refer to your picture, you will see in that lower right corner, a line of burnt sienna, and that burnt sienna I'm putting into my sap color while it's nice and wet so that it will soften itself in the green. Then I'm going to be putting in some black close to the white rose petal, and again allowing it to soften itself in the wet green. The upper right section, filling that in, same thing, sap mixed with a very little bit of ultramarine blue. And while that green is nice and wet, I'm going to be putting in some really intense black up against that white rose petal. That's going to help to make that rose really pop out. I also put in a little bit of the burnt sienna color, but it's up to you if you want to put that color in or not. The burnt sienna color is just to kind of make it look like there's branches or rose stems below this bloom, just so I'm not dealing just with all green. But you want to do it while it's nice and wet so that it softens itself in the green and you don't have a hard edge. Now I'm going to be adding some more intensity to the color in the lower left. So I want to add some additional ultramarine and some additional green so that I can fill in and leave some of those little markings that were lighter. I can leave them the original green color. Now this is the wash where I'm going to be putting in my blacks. So I'm going to soften some edges just with plain water, and I am going to add my blacks and soften those edges. Before you start this section though, you want to make sure that it is totally dry, because if it's just slightly dry and you start to put wet color on, you're going to get a wash back, and you do not want that. So make sure it's totally dry before you start adding this more intense color and start softening edges. Now up in my upper right where I have that nice dark black, I rolled a paper towel and I'm going to put it down a couple times to make it look like there are some stems or some crumpled leaves in that background. It's not going to be very evident, but I'm going to cover that with some darker green later. But just because it was so nice and smooth back there, I wanted to go ahead and put some texturing back there. So it's just a rolled paper towel, lay it down in that wet paint and lift it and allow that to totally dry. And then we will cover it with some color later. Now, beginning with that top petal, the one that is open the most, I'm going to start with some sap mixed with some yellow, lots of water to it. I don't want intense color, but I'm going to put that right where it attaches to the rose, kind of in an arch, and then I'm going to dry brush off the edges in the direction that the petal would be going. So once I get that put in like a nice semicircle, then I'm going to dry brush off the edge to almost make it look like a sunburst. And that's going to help to define some of the veins that we'll be putting in later. So this is just a nice light wash of your sap green mixed with some yellow, lots of water. It's kind of in an arch, kind of a semicircle. Make sure it's nice and wet so that you can go back in and dry brush off the edge, because if you let it dry, then you're not going to be able to do that. Well, you can still do it, but you're going to have hard lines that you really don't want. You want this to look like it's all one wash. Nice and wet. Dry brush that off to make it look like a sunburst on that petal. Now I'm going to be moving over to the far right petal that's curled out, and I'm going to wet the petal about halfway up because I'm going to just put some color along the edge, couple inches worth. Same thing, that sap mixed with some yellow, but this is very pale. And all I'm going to be doing with this is throwing some salt on it to give this petal that is nice and close some texturing. Not a very dark color, really pale. Sap mixed with a little bit of yellow. I watered off the edge so that it was nice and smooth and blended. And then I'm just going to throw on some salt on that edge. Same thing on this petal that's going to eventually have a very heavy shadow on it. But right underneath that flip over of another petal, I'm using the same thing, light sap mixed with some yellow, watering off the edge so it's a nice soft edge, and throwing some salt on there also. Make sure it's nice and smooth and you don't have any hard lines there. Now I'm going to go to the very center of my rose, and with some yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of cad yellow, I'm coloring in that very, very, very tight center. Refer to your picture. You'll see where it's the yellowest. That whole section I'm painting in with my cad yellow mixed with a little bit of yellow ochre. Now I'm going to start to put some color on the underside of some of these petals. This again is going to be very watered down color. Nothing about this white rose other than some of the shadowing is very dark in color. Always sap mixed with a little bit of yellow and a lot of water. I'm doing the underside of this petal along the edges, and then I am using my water just to soften those edges. Now, when I'm finished with the softening of this, I'm going to use my fan brush just for a few things, and that's all I'm going to be using it for. Instead of individually drawing a lot of veins in my rose bud, the actual bud part, I'm just going to use my fan brush and this light color of sap and yellow, and I'm going to shape the bud just with my fan. So my fan brush is going from right to left horizontally as if it would come up and out the petal. And I'm just doing that on those two sections of the rosebud. If you want to use your fan later, instead of individually drawing in some of your veining, you can. But otherwise, I'm using it very sporadically, not a lot, because I prefer to use my rigger to paint them in later. Now I want to go ahead and start to deepen this petal that is really opened up, because not only is it opened up, but the way it's cupped, it's shadowed nice and deep in color. I'm not using my black yet. I'm just using a darker shade of my green. So I'm using my sap, more ultramarine than the green, and I'm kind of filling in that same cupped shape, that same semicircle, and I'm softening the edge. But I want to get some deeper color down close to that actual rose bud, the tight bud part. So I'm softening the edge, but I'm filling it in so that it kind of has a cupped shape. Now there are some darker lines that are going to help to form the right bend in that petal. So I'm using that color for that, and I'm throwing some salt on this darker color because that's going to give me some of the texture that I want. Very slightly though. It's not going to react greatly because I already have a few washes of color on there. I'm going to make these very evident texture lines disappear now. I've mixed black with some sap, more black than sap, and I'm painting over these texturings that I put in with a paper towel, and then I will go ahead and soften the very edge of it as I move out towards the edge of my paper. So I only want it to be nice and intensely dark right up close to my rose petals. Now I'm going to use some sap mixed with some black and a lot of water to paint this little part of the rose, not a leaf, but where it attaches to the stem. I'm using sap mixed with some black. It's going to have a black center later, but for now I'm painting the whole thing in with some sap mixed with some black. Get some nice hard edges with the paint when it comes up against the dry paint, which is what I want for this because it's a totally separate thing. Sap mixed with black and paint it all in. Make sure you're nice and wet so that it's nice and smooth. Now while that's drying, I'm going to start my shadowing because with a white flower, again, there's not a lot of color because it's white. So most of your, your color is shadowing. So I mixed some of my sap with some black, more black than sap, and I put some water to it. And I'm going to start going now petal by petal and putting in my shadows. And if you look at your picture will define where your shadowing should be. It'll also define for you if it's a hard shadow or a soft shadow. If it's softer shadows, then you want to soften it with water. You want to make sure you take that water down into your shadowing so that you get a nice smooth edge. You don't want to wash back with your water. You want a smooth edge with your water. So you want to take that water down in to your shadowing, move it around a little bit so it evens out with your shadowing color. You're going to go petal by petal. Each petal is different. So you follow your picture as well as the video and just do petal by petal. I have each petal done in the video. I didn't skip over any. All you have to do is follow what I've done. Look ahead Make sure you're looking ahead so that you know what you're getting into. Make sure you know if it's going to be a hard shadow or a soft shadow. And make sure that your shadows are dark enough but not black. You want them just to be a nice watered down black shadow. You don't want your shadows to be black. And I added that little bit of sap green to them so that they would have just a little bit of a color to it so that it wasn't just, like a gray color. It's more of a greenish gray color. I did leave some of this petal not painted. There's that little triangle on the left, which really adds to the picture. It gives it some interest. And you definitely want to make sure that you don't do petal up against another petal so that you don't do wet against wet. You want to do wet against dry, or you want to do dry against dry, but you don't ever want to do the wet against wet because you'll get washback and you won't be happy with your end result. Moving on to another petal now. I'm doing this lower petal, and this one is a hard shadow. So I'm not going to be softening the edges. It's a very hard, distinct shadow. I'm deepening that little corner just by adding some extra black while it's wet. Moving towards the center, if you look at your picture, you'll see where the darker parts are for your flower. This is where the petals are tightly rolled. You can hardly see down into them, but there are some sections that are nice and dark because of how tightly rolled they are. There's no light getting down in there. And this is just my watered down black. While those are drying, I'm just going to continually move on and do my shadows on all of my petals. Some of my petals are going to get 2 washes of shadow, meaning some of the petals will have a light shadow on almost the entire petal, and then when that's dry, there will be additional shadowing on top of that that are showing distinctive shapes or distinctive areas that are getting shadowed. The prime example is the lower right, where that petal is turned towards you. You can see there are 2 values of shadow that will be down there. So watch your video a little bit ahead each time so that you can see where I'm shadowing and how I'm shadowing, if it's hard or soft, if I'm dry brushing the edge or not, and you will be able to just follow exactly what I'm doing with what you are doing. The petals that have that little bit of a flip over on the edge, I dry brushed those edges to show mainly the roughness of the petals. The petals close up show more roughness than those in a distance. The rose petals, even though they're nice and smooth and soft, they do have a texture to them, and your dry brushing is going to help that. The petal I'm showing you now has a nice, dark, distinctive shadow, and the edge along the upper circular section is dry brushed off. The part along the thin curl is just a nice soft shadow. Some shadows have distinctive shapes, others do not. Others need softened. Some are left as hard shadows that have specific shapes. Just follow your picture and the video. Now this lower right petal that has the petal curving towards me, this is the one that has the two values of shadow in it. The first value covers almost the entire flipped over part of the petal. The edge is left and it's a nice rough zigzagged edge, but the rest of the petal is totally painted in with a lighter value of the shadow. Once that is dried really well, then I went over it a second time and put in distinctive shapes in the darker shadow. Not much darker, basically the same shade as the first one, but now it's a double layer, so you can definitely see where it's been painted. The underside of this right petal is sap mixed with a little bit of black, painting it in. While it is still wet, I'm going to be adding in some additional watered down black just to help to show some additional shaping to that petal, but also where some softer shadows would be. So the whole underside of that petal is getting painted in with my sap mixed with a little bit of black and water, so it's nice and muted in color. It's not real intense, but I'm doing it so that it's nice and wet. I want it to remain nice and wet so that I can add my black to that and brush my black through it, and my black will soften itself in the wetness of the green. While that's drying a bit, I can go ahead and put in my second wash of my shadow on that same petal, because I have that little bit of plain white rose that's separating out my wetness from the underside of the petal, so I'm not going wet against wet. There is some dry in between, even though it's a very thin line of dry. And I'm putting in that distinctive shape with my watered down black, and that's going to make that petal really interesting. my shadow on the actual bud, that nice tight barrel-shaped bud. It gets a nice shadow, and you want that shadow to kind of be as dark as the shadow that is right up against it. Because it's so close together, it has to have the same intensity. So make sure that your shadow on this tight bud is very similar to the shadow that is on the open petal. Now you're going to go through all of the parts of your rose, and you want to see what you need to do yet. Where did you miss out on a shadow? Where do you have to add maybe a little bit more yellow green? Where do you have to deepen a shadow? Whatever you need to do, take it petal by petal, compare it to either the video or the picture, and add what you need to add. Now my petal, the lower petal, it cannot be white. It's not white in my picture. So I'm putting on a very watered down sap mixed with some black, lots of water, and then I will extend that color over to the other petal next to it on top of the shadow, just to give it some additional coloring, because I don't want that petal to look like it's just gray and white. I want it to actually look like it has a little bit of a color to it, even though it's white. So I'm just using that same color, but I'm just taking that color over to the shadow and going over the shadowed part with that color, so that that shadow just doesn't look like a funny gray color. It's more of a greenish gray color, which is perfectly fine for my shadow on that petal. I'm adding my little bits of color wherever I need it, and I'm going up now to put some color on the stem. This is actually the stems on that rose bush. I'm putting another wash of sap mixed with some black on that to deepen that. That's going to help to separate that out from both the background and the rose, so it doesn't look like it's part of a petal, it's the stem. And I'm softening that, and I'll dry brush with a little bit of black on that when it's dry. Now, using my rigger, I'm going to use my watered down sap, and I'm going to start to put on my veins. I'm not putting veins on every petal. I'm only putting them on the petals that are reaching out to me, that are right in front of me. Most especially that flipped over petal on the right. That is going to get the most intense veins, but they will still be very pale in color. But that one is so big and has reached out to the foreground. So that one, I want those veins to be very, very evident. Lastly, I'm going to put a few little Chinese white hairs on my stem. These are these little thorns that are like little hairs, but just enough to really pinch you when you go to pick your rose. Just a few. And you are finished. It's beautiful. You can almost smell it from here. Enjoy this painting. And always happy painting.